All right, let's be real. Epic battles on the big screen, they're irresistible.
Oh, absolutely.
The clash of steel, those thundering charges, enough to get anyone's heart racing.
Yeah.
But have you ever wondered
Yeah.
just how much of that Hollywood spectacle is actually, well, historically accurate?
Well, that's a great question. What's fascinating is that Hollywood often takes quite a few liberties with the historical record, sometimes for dramatic effect, sometimes, well, maybe due to a lack of thorough research.
Exactly. And that's why we're diving deep today into 10 famous battles where Hollywood's version might have you believing some things that are, shall we say, a bit off the mark.
It's really interesting when you start peeling back the layers and looking at what actually happened versus what we see on the screen.
And this isn't just about nitpicking historical details.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how those cinematic interpretations can shape our perceptions of the past.
Right.
And even influence our views on current events.
So if we only ever see these romanticized,
Often simplified versions of conflict,
yeah,
we might not fully grasp the true cost of war, the intricate strategies involved,
right,
the lasting consequences.
precisely. And, it's not just about war movies either. Think about historical dramas that portray political events or social movements. If those narratives are skewed or oversimplified, it can affect our understanding of those historical periods and even influence our views on similar issues today.
It's like we're being subtly influenced without even realizing it. But luckily for you, we're here to help you become more informed viewers, ready to dig a bit deeper
Yes.
and challenge those cinematic narratives, ready to separate fact from fiction.
Let's dive in.
Okay, picture this. The iconic bridge scene in Braveheart. William Wallace rallying his troops for a heroic charge against the English.
Yeah.
It's pretty much etched in our collective movie memory. But
Yeah.
this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
The real Battle of Stirling Bridge was a far cry from that epic cavalry charge across an open field.
The film takes quite a few liberties with that particular historical event. In reality, the Scots, led by William Wallace, used the narrow bridge itself to their advantage, luring the English army onto the bridge and then launching a surprise attack. Many English soldiers were pushed into the river Forth.
So instead of brute force, it was a clever ambush that exploited the terrain.
Exactly. It demonstrates a key principle of military strategy, using the environment to your advantage.
Now, think about how often you see that in war films. The grand, open field battle where armies just clash head-on. It's more visually spectacular, sure.
Makes for great cinema.
But often the reality involved a lot more strategic maneuvering and clever tactics.
Precisely. And Stirling Bridge is a perfect example of that. William Wallace and his forces used their knowledge of the terrain and their opponent's weaknesses to achieve a decisive victory.
Next up, we're heading to ancient Greece, where the movie 300 gave us those incredibly ripped Spartans facing off against a seemingly endless wave of Persians. Visually, it's stunning.
Oh, it's spectacular.
But historically, not quite so accurate.
While the Spartans were undoubtedly skilled warriors, the film portrays them as almost superhuman.
Right.
Battling fantastical creatures
Yeah.
and facing an enemy whose numbers were vastly inflated for dramatic effect.
I remember that scene where they kicked that poor messenger down the well.
A rather dramatic scene indeed. But what's crucial to remember is that the real Battle of Thermopylae was a desperate delaying action, fought in a narrow pass. It was a valiant last stand by a small Greek force, sacrificing themselves to buy time for the rest of the Greek army to prepare for the Persian invasion.
So it was less about superhuman feats and more about a calculated sacrifice for the greater good.
Yes. And this event is often romanticized as a pivotal moment in the fight for Greek freedom, but it's important to understand the strategic context and the actual scale of the conflict, which differed considerably from the film's portrayal.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Asterix and Obelix. Mission Cleopatra.
Okay, yeah.
A hilarious,
Very funny movie.
comedic take on the siege of Elysia.
Yeah.
But it kind of glosses over what made that siege such a turning point in Roman history.
The film's humor is undeniable, but it does reduce the siege to a somewhat chaotic and farcical affair, missing the strategic brilliance of Julius Caesar's victory. Elysia was a testament to Roman military discipline, meticulous planning, and remarkable engineering.
You might be surprised to learn that Caesar actually constructed two massive fortifications.
Really?
one around the besieged Gallic city and another to protect his army from outside reinforcements.
Exactly. The Romans essentially created a fortress within a fortress, showcasing their superior logistical capabilities and their commitment to a long-term strategy. The film doesn't quite capture that aspect of the siege.
Speaking of sieges,
Yeah.
the Alamo is another battle that Hollywood often portrays in a somewhat romanticized light.
The bravery of those who defended the Alamo is undeniable. However, the films often simplify the complex political climate surrounding the battle and don't quite capture the brutality of the fighting.
So while the films focus on individual acts of courage, they sometimes miss the bigger picture, the political and social forces that led to the conflict in the first place.
Precisely. The motivations of the participants were far more complex, and the fighting far more savage than what's often depicted. And this often leads to a rather sanitized version of history, where the nuances and complexities are lost in favor of a more straightforward narrative.
Right. So even though these films can be entertaining,
Right.
it's important to remember that they're just one interpretation of events.
And often, those interpretations prioritize dramatic effect over historical accuracy.
Speaking of interpretations,
Let's
talk about Alexander the Great and his decisive victory at the Battle of Gaugamela.
Yeah.
It's often considered one of the greatest military achievements of all time.
Yeah.
But the movie Alexander kind of portrays it as a chaotic free-for-all.
The film doesn't quite capture the tactical brilliance of Alexander's strategy. Gaugamela was a masterpiece of military maneuvering. Alexander used his cavalry to draw out the Persian forces, then exploited gaps in their lines with precise attacks. It was a testament to his ability to adapt and outmaneuver his opponents.
So instead of just a chaotic clash, it was a carefully orchestrated plan that relied on timing, deception, and a deep understanding of the battlefield.
Exactly, and it really showcases Alexander's genius as a military commander.
Now think about this. How often do we see battle scenes in films that are just massive, chaotic clashes? It might be exciting to watch, but it often overlooks the strategic brilliance that often determine the outcome of these historical conflicts.
It's a common trope in historical films, often sacrificing accuracy for visual spectacle. And it's why it's so important to look beyond those cinematic representations and delve into the real stories behind these events. And welcome back to our deep dive into Hollywood's take on historical battles. We've already uncovered some surprising truths about battles you might have thought you knew, but there's so much more to explore.
It's amazing how these films can transport us to another time and place. But it's also important to remember that they're telling a story, and sometimes that story takes liberties with the historical record.
It's a delicate balance between entertainment and accuracy. And as we've seen, sometimes that balance tips more towards dramatic effect than historical fact.
Right. And that's why it's so important to engage with these films critically. Don't just accept everything you see on screen as gospel truth.
Exactly. Do your own research, consider multiple perspectives, and don't be afraid to question the narrative.
Speaking of questioning the narrative, let's talk about Agincourt. Both classic and modern films tend to depict the English victory as this incredible feat of heroism against all odds. I remember those scenes with the archers raining arrows down on the French knights. Pretty epic stuff.
The English longbowmen certainly played a key role in the battle, but the victory was due to more than just English bravery. The terrain played a significant factor. The battlefield was muddy and narrow, which hindered the French cavalry and their heavily armored knights. And the French made some critical tactical errors that worked to the English advantage.
So a combination of luck, terrain, and French blunders.
Exactly. The English were certainly skilled, but the victory was as much about circumstance as it was about military prowess. And it's a good reminder that historical events are often shaped by a multitude of factors, not just individual heroism.
Now, you might be familiar with the recent Netflix series Barbarians, which tells the story of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Visually, it's quite impressive. But it portrays the Germanic tribes as this unified force under a single leader, which wasn't exactly the case.
The series simplifies a complex historical situation. The Germanic tribes were not a homogeneous entity, but rather a collection of different groups with their own leaders and motivations. Their victory against the Romans was a result of coordinated action, but not necessarily unified leadership in the way the series portrays.
So it was more about a shared goal than a single charismatic leader.
Precisely. The tribes recognized the threat posed by Roman expansion and, despite their internal differences, managed to band together long enough to achieve a stunning victory. Understanding those nuances is crucial to understanding the battle's significance.
It's like a reminder that history is rarely as straightforward as it appears in movies and TV shows.
It's full of complexities and contradictions, and those nuances often get lost in the translation to the screen.
Okay, let's fast forward to World War II and a battle that's been depicted in numerous films. The Battle of the Bulge. The movie Battle of the Bulge comes to mind, but it takes some serious liberties with historical accuracy.
The film drastically simplifies the scale and complexity of the battle. It focuses on a small group of American soldiers single-handedly stopping the German advance, which is a far cry from what actually happened.
I remember thinking, wow, that's a bit far-fetched, even as a kid watching it. But it makes for a more dramatic story, I guess.
The real Battle of the Bulge was a massive engagement involving hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides, fought in brutal winter conditions. It was a pivotal moment in the war, but the film's portrayal doesn't quite capture the scope or the sacrifice involved.
It's a good reminder to be critical of those heroic narratives we often see in war films. Sometimes the real heroes are the countless individuals who fought and died without ever having their stories told on the big screen.
It's essential to remember the human cost of war, even when we're enjoying a fictionalized version of events.
Let's talk about Hannibal, the brilliant Carthaginian general who challenged Roman dominance. The movie Hannibal depicts the Battle of Cannae, but it doesn't quite capture the tactical genius of Hannibal's strategy.
Hannibal's double envelopment maneuver at Cannae was a masterpiece of military strategy. Imagine this. He intentionally weakened his center, luring the Romans in. As they pressed their attack, Hannibal's stronger flanks swung inward, encircling the Roman army and leading to a devastating defeat.
So picture it like two arms of an army closing in, trapping the enemy in a pincer movement.
Precisely. It was a brilliant tactical move that has been studied by military strategists for centuries. The film, while visually impressive, doesn't quite convey the complexity or the significance of Hannibal's victory.
And it's interesting to think about how those ancient battles still influence military thinking today.
Many of the strategies and tactics developed in those ancient conflicts are still relevant in modern warfare, though obviously adapted to modern technology.
Now, for our next stop on this journey, let's head to Gettysburg, a pivotal battle in the American Civil War. The movie Gettysburg is often praised for its historical accuracy, but even it simplifies certain aspects of the battle and its aftermath.
While the film strives for authenticity, it still streamlines events and motivations for the sake of storytelling. It's important to remember that the battle involved complex political and social factors, and its consequences reverberated throughout American history.
So even films that aim for historical accuracy can't always capture the full scope of such a significant event.
Exactly. They have to make choices about what to include and what to leave out, which inevitably shapes the viewer's understanding of the event.
It's like we always need to be aware that we're only getting a partial view, a glimpse into a much larger and more complex story.
Precisely. And it's up to us to dig deeper and explore those untold stories, to understand the context and the nuances that often get left out of the cinematic narrative.
You know, as we're going through these examples, it's striking how many times Hollywood inserts fictional elements into real historical events. Sometimes it's a love story, sometimes it's a heroic feat that never actually happened, and sometimes it's just altering the timeline to make the story more exciting.
It's a common practice. And while it can be entertaining, it's important to be aware of those fictional elements and to understand how they might be shaping our perception of history.
Right. Because even though we might know that a movie is fictionalized, those images and stories can stick with us, influencing how we view the past.
They can create lasting impressions that are difficult to shake, even when we know they're not entirely accurate.
Okay, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about Saving Private Ryan. It's often lauded for its realistic depiction of the D-Day landings, particularly that incredibly intense opening sequence on Omaha Beach.
The film's depiction of the D-Day landings is widely considered to be incredibly realistic and impactful. It captures the chaos, the brutality, and the sheer scale of the operation. However, the story of the squad sent to locate Private Ryan is a fictional creation.
So that heartwarming tale of brotherhood amidst the carnage is a product of Hollywood storytelling.
Exactly. While based on a real program to send surviving sons home, the specific story of Private Ryan was crafted to personalize the larger conflict, highlighting the human cost of war and the bonds formed between soldiers.
It's interesting how they used fiction to explore those emotional truths within a historical context.
It's a powerful storytelling technique, and it reminds us that even fictional accounts can offer valuable insights into the human experience of war.
Speaking of fictional accounts, let's talk about Gladiator. I mean, who doesn't love a good Roman epic?
Yeah.
but just how much of that film is grounded in historical reality.
While Gladiator captures the grandeur of the Roman Colosseum and the brutality of gladiatorial combat, it also takes quite a few liberties with the historical context. The film compresses the timeline, fictionalizes characters, and simplifies political intrigue for the sake of dramatic effect.
So more of a Hollywood interpretation of ancient Rome than a strict historical account.
Precisely. It takes inspiration from historical elements, but ultimately crafts its own narrative, focusing on themes of revenge, redemption, and the struggle for power.
All right, for our final stop on this Hollywood versus history journey, let's delve into a film that takes us to the heart of the Vietnam War, Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now is a cinematic masterpiece, a surreal and haunting exploration of the psychological toll of war. However, it's not meant to be a historically accurate depiction of the Vietnam War.
It's more about capturing the essence of the conflict, the moral ambiguity, and the descent into madness.
Exactly. The film draws inspiration from Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, transposing its themes of colonialism and psychological darkness to the setting of the Vietnam War. It's a powerful film, but it's not a history lesson.
So even though it's set during a historical event, it's more about exploring universal human themes than depicting specific historical facts.
Precisely. And it demonstrates how film can use history as a springboard to delve into deeper truths about the human condition.
It seems like Hollywood has a knack for blending fact and fiction, using history as a canvas for storytelling, but often altering the details to fit the narrative.
It's a delicate balance, and one that viewers should be aware of. But even when Hollywood takes liberties, it can still spark our curiosity about the past, leading us to explore those stories further and discover the truth behind the fiction.
And we're back for the final act of our deep dive into Hollywood versus history. We've explored some pretty epic battles from ancient Greece to the battlefields of World War II and uncovered some surprising truths along the way.
We've seen how Hollywood often takes creative liberties, blending fact and fiction, sometimes for dramatic effect, sometimes maybe due to a lack of thorough research. But as we've discussed, it's not just about nitpicking historical details.
Right, it's about recognizing how those cinematic interpretations, those stories we see on screen, can subtly shape our understanding of history. And that can even influence how we view current events.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that we should always be critical viewers, not just passively absorbing information, but actively engaging with it, questioning it, and seeking out multiple perspectives.
You know, it's like we've been talking about throughout this deep dive. Those simplified or romanticized versions of history we often see in films can give us a skewed perspective. If we only see heroic charges and epic battles, we might miss the complexity of the strategic thinking involved, the logistical challenges, or the human cost of war.
And it goes beyond just war films. Historical dramas that depict political events or social movements can also be prone to oversimplification, which can in turn affect our understanding of those historical periods and even influence our views on similar issues today.
So what can we do about it? What's the takeaway for you, our listener, who's been on this journey with us?
Well, become an informed viewer. Don't just take everything you see on screen at face value. Do your own research, dig a little deeper, and consider those multiple perspectives we've been talking about.
It's like becoming a history detective.
Exactly.
Use those films as a starting point, a spark to ignite your curiosity. Then go beyond the silver screen. Read books, explore documentaries, visit museums, and engage in conversations with people who have different viewpoints.
And when you encounter those conflicting accounts, those different interpretations of history, ask yourself, who's telling the story? What might be their motivations or biases? What might be missing from their narrative?
Yeah, it's about recognizing that history is rarely black and white. There are often shades of gray, complexities, and contradictions that don't always translate easily to the big screen.
Exactly. And by embracing that complexity, by delving into those nuances, you can gain a much richer and more meaningful understanding of the past.
You know, it's fascinating to think about how history is an ongoing conversation. It's not just a collection of facts and dates, but a dynamic and ever-evolving interpretation of events. And each generation brings its own perspectives and insights to that conversation.
Precisely. And it's by engaging in that conversation, by questioning, exploring, and sharing what we learn, that we keep history alive and relevant.
So the next time you're watching a historical epic, remember, it's just one interpretation, one perspective on a much larger story. Don't be afraid to challenge the narrative, to dig deeper, and to share what you uncover. You might be surprised by what you find.
And who knows, you might even discover that the real story is even more captivating than the Hollywood version.
Well, there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into Hollywood versus history has come to an end. We've shattered some cinematic myths, uncovered some hidden truths, and hopefully inspired you to be a more critical and engaged viewer of history, both on screen and off. Thanks for joining us.